The hearth in the grand drawing room of the Vance estate did not merely warm the air, it consumed it. The fire crackled with a dry, artificial arrogance, fueled by imported birch logs that smelled of expensive, manicured forests. To 18-year-old Diana Vance, the dry heat felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribcage, thick with the heavy scent of old money-polished mahogany and unadulterated contempt. At the center of the room sat Eleanor Vance. Her posture was an architectural marvel of high society breeding spine, perfectly rigid chin, tilted at an angle that forced her to look down her nose at the world. She wore a tailored charcoal silk suit that rustled like a viper shifting through dead leaves. Her diamonds were large, square-cut, and utterly cold. "You are looking at me as if you expect applause, Diana," Eleanor said, her voice a low, gravelly purr cultivated in the boardrooms of Wall Street and the charity galas of Manhattan. She did not look up from her gold-rimmed financial ledger. "You have always had that tiresome, dramatic look in your eyes. It is remarkably bourgeois." Diana stood at the edge of the Persian rug, her fingers clamped tightly over the crisp, heavy manila envelope in her hands. The gold foil seal of the United States Department of the Air Force caught the flickering light of the fireplace. Inside those pages lay her escape hatch, an elite, highly restricted special appointment to the United States Air Force Academy, paired with a full-ride scholarship for strategic aviation operations. She had placed first in the nation on the technical flight dynamics and strategic aptitude exams. She had endured the grueling physical screenings in secret, pulling herself through miles of grueling endurance tests while her family slept under goose-down duvets. "It is an appointment, Mother," Diana said, keeping her tone measured, though her voice lacked the warm resonance she wished it had. It sounded thin like glass cooled too quickly. "The Academy. I scored top of the selection tier for strategic tactical piloting. They are giving me a direct path to the stratospheric bomber fleet." Eleanor finally closed the ledger. The heavy leather cover met the mahogany desk with a dull, final thud. She turned her gaze to Diana, her eyes two chips of pale, unfeeling agate. There was no pride in that look. There was not even anger. There was only the clinical disgust one might reserve for an unaccounted-for expense on a balance sheet. "An appointment," Eleanor repeated the word, tasting like sour vinegar on her tongue. "A government handout wrapped in cheap patriotism. You speak of jets and mud as if you have accomplished something noble. Let me make something entirely clear to your stunted little mind, Diana. Within the architecture of the Vance dynasty, you are not an asset. You are a line item depreciation. You are an unrecoverable overhead cost." The words cut precise and surgically clean. Diana did not flinch, but her grip on the envelope tightened until the heavy paper creaked. "I earned this," Diana whispered. "I didn't use the family name. I didn't use grandfather's trust. I used my own mind." "And that is precisely why it is worthless," Eleanor snapped, her voice rising just enough to cut through the crackle of the birch logs. She stood up her silk suit, whispering its venomous song. She walked toward Diana with the slow, predatory grace of a woman who had broken bank boards and severed corporate lineages before breakfast. "The Vance name exists to command capital, not to serve it. Your sister Cassandra is currently completing her executive preparation at Wharton. By 24, he will sit on the executive committee of Vance Global Energy. By 30, she will control the federal energy defense allocations for the Eastern Seaboard. She is the lineage. She is the profit center." She stopped inches from Diana. The scent of her Chanel No. 5 was suffocating a floral shroud over a rotten core. "And you?" Eleanor laughed, a short, dry bark that did not reach her eyes. "You are a shadow, Diana. Your only structural utility to this family is to sign a strategic marriage contract with a Wall Street oil tycoon's eldest son. That merger brings $40 million in liquid capital into our energy infrastructure. That is your duty. That is your sole purpose. I won't sign it, Diana said, her heart hammering against her sternum like a trapped bird. I am leaving for Colorado Springs in the morning. Eleanor did not yell. She merely reached out with a manicured hand, her fingernails painted the color of dried arterial blood, and ripped the manila envelope out of Diana's hand. Mother! With a swift, elegant motion, Eleanor tossed the thick packet directly into the center of the roaring fireplace. The flames leapt up hungrily, licking at the gold foil seal of the Department of the Air Force. The heavy parchment blister turned a bruised black, and then caught fire, the elegant calligraphy of Diana's name curling into gray, unrecognizable ash. There is no academy, Eleanor said softly, turning her back to the fire to look at her daughter. There is no strategic fleet. Tomorrow you will sit with the tailor for your engagement gown fitting. If you attempt to leave this house, I will have the state police pick you up as a flight risk dependent under psychiatric evaluation. I control the local judges, Diana. I control the narrative. You are nothing but what I allow you to be. Diana stared at the fireplace. The ash of her dreams was floating up the chimney, disappearing into the cold New York night. Something deep within her chest, something that had been fragile and desperate for love, shattered into tiny, jagged shards of ice. The warmth left her face. Her hands stopped shaking. She looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw nothing but a paper empire built on the exploitation of others. You shouldn't have done that, Diana said. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the flat, dead tone of a cockpit warning system before a total system blackout. Get out of my sight, Eleanor said dismissively, waving a hand as she sat back down at her desk. You bore me. By midnight, the house was silent. A savage nor'easter had blown in from the Atlantic, throwing sheets of freezing sleet against the tall arched windows of the Vance Manor. The temperature had plummeted past 20 below zero, turning the long, sweeping driveway into a sheet of black, murderous ice. Diana adjusted the heavy canvas straps of the 2 military sea bags over her shoulders. The rough fabric bit into her collarbones through her thin denim jacket, but the pain was grounding. It reminded her that she was alive, that she was separate from the golden cage. She did not look back at the grand portrait of the Vance family hanging in the foyer. She stepped out into the blinding white fury of the blizzard. The wind hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs, but she dug her boots into the ice and moved forward. Behind her, the mansion loomed like a great dark mausoleum. Ahead of her lay the abyss, cold, dark, and utterly free. The recruitment office in Brooklyn smelled of floor wax, wet wool, and cheap coffee. It was 3 days after the blizzard, and Diana's toes were still numb from the long walk to the train station. The recruiter, a grizzled Air Force Master Sergeant with a face like weathered leather and a Master Pilot wing insignia pinned proudly to his chest, looked at the 18-year-old girl sitting across from him. Her hands were raw. Her jacket was damp, and her eyes were the color of winter storm clouds. You're a long way from the Upper East Side, kid, Master Sergeant Davis said, flipping through her identification documents. Name says Vance. Same family that owns Vance Global Energy. No relation. Diana lied without a single blink. I need an enlistment contract. Now. General aviation, mechanical, or flight operations support if you have it. Davis leaned back his chair, squeaking in protest. Enlisted a girl with your test scores. You blew the ASVB and the AF Okti out of the water. You could sit in a nice air-conditioned room in Maryland and translate satellite data for the NSA. Why the flight line? The flight line is no place for anyone who likes their hands clean. I don't care about clean hands, Diana said flatly. Give me the contract, Master Sergeant, or I walk across the street to the Navy. Davis grunted, a flicker of respect crossing his worn features. All right, Vance. You want the harsh skies. You got it. But up there, nobody cares who your family is. Up there, the lack of oxygen wants to kill you from the second you seal the canopy to the second you land. It doesn't discriminate. The next 3 years were a blur of gray metal burning aviation fuel and the constant rhythmic scream of turbofan engines. While her sister Cassandra was attending high society mixers and learning how to manipulate global oil prices at Wharton, Diana was crawling through the tight maintenance tunnels of strategic aircraft. She didn't go to the academy. She entered through the enlistment path, starting at the very bottom of the Air Force hierarchy as an airman basic. She became a flight line rat. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew thick with calluses and stained with the black, stubborn grease of hydraulic valves and jet propellant. She learned the anatomy of a strategic bomber the way a surgeon knows the human body. She could trace an electrical short by smell in pitch-black darkness while the hangar was freezing under a Midwestern winter. The fleet didn't care about her pedigree, but her instructors quickly realized she possessed an unnatural, almost terrifying immunity to stress under high G-forces and low oxygen environments. During the altitude chamber training in Texas, recruits were subjected to hypobaric conditions designed to simulate rapid decompression at 30,000 feet. Many grew disoriented, their lungs seizing as they scrambled for their oxygen masks in panic. When it was Diana's turn, the chamber air thinned rapidly. The pressure dropped, popping her eardrums with a sharp hiss. Through the viewing port, the medical officer watched her heart rate monitor. Most recruits saw their pulse spike to 140, even 160 beats per minute during sudden decompression. Diana's monitor read a steady, unyielding 62. She looked through the glass with wide, unblinking eyes, her breathing steady through her nose, completely untroubled by the hostile environment. She pulled her oxygen mask on with the slow, deliberate grace of a seasoned pilot. "She's not brave," the aviation medical officer murmured, watching the data feed. "Brave means you feel fear and override it. That girl, her nervous system doesn't register the altitude as an enemy. She thinks she belongs up there." By her 4th year, Diana had achieved something almost mythical within the aviation community. She had transitioned from the enlisted ranks to an elite, highly restricted commission through the senior airman to officer program, her sheer brilliance in atmospheric navigation and flight dynamics making her irreplaceable. She was no longer just fixing fuel manifolds. She was writing the code for how stealth bombers bypassed advanced radar networks. Her life was measured in Mach numbers, knots, and thousands of feet of altitude. She had traded the opulent fabrics of the Vance estate for flame-retardant flight suits that smelled faintly of anti-exposure fluid and oxygen seal grease. Her home was the Stealth Fleet, an experimental wing of long-range strategic bombers painted in a specialized radar-absorbent matte black skin. They were ghost planes, black-budget assets whose operational deployments were denied by the Pentagon. They carried no squadron insignias on their stabilizers. They flew along the edge of space, blending into the background radiation of the stratosphere. "Vance!" called out Colonel Marcus Vance. No relation, her commanding officer at the time, as they sat in the dim, blue-lit confines of the mission planning room during an exercise over the Nevada desert. "Look at this radar return profile. What do you see?" Diana adjusted her terminal, her eyes tracking the cascading lines of the radar cross-section data. The screen showed a chaotic mess of atmospheric noise, weather anomalies, and bird migrations. "It's not an atmospheric disturbance, sir," Diana said, her fingers dancing across the terminal, isolating a minute rhythmic variation in the wave return. "It's a Doppler shift. They're running an active jamming loop trying to mask their tracking station inside a commercial weather radar frequency. If we fly our standard path, they'll paint our underbelly the moment we bank. Colonel Vance pulled his glasses down, staring at her with a mixture of awe and profound unease. The strategic computer didn't even flag that, Diana. It categorized it as a rain cloud. The computer looks for matches in a database, Colonel, Diana replied, her voice deadpan. I look for things that are trying too hard to look natural. Nature is chaotic. Electronic warfare signatures are always desperate to maintain a rhythm. While Diana was identifying hostile air defense networks, by the microscopic imperfections of their radar emission profiles, her family was perfecting her obituary of irrelevance back in New York. At the annual Vance Global Energy Shareholder Gala held in a glittering glass atrium overlooking Central Park, Cassandra Vance took the stage. She was 25 now, immaculate in a designer dress, her hair styled by the city's top artists. She smiled down at the investors, exuding the effortless confidence of someone who had never had to fight for her air. We are expanding our global defense logistics, Cassandra announced, gesturing to a massive projection screen showing rendering models of massive fuel pipelines. While some branches of our family have chosen less ambitious paths, my sister Diana, for instance, who I believe is currently performing administrative inventory work for the Air Force Supply Depot in Washington, counting rusted screws and logging manifests, Vance Global Energy continues to operate at the absolute vanguard of global capital. Eleanor Vance sat in the front row, sipping her champagne, nodding with cold approval. To the elite circles of New York, Diana was a shameful secret, a broken link in the dynastic chain who had washed out of society to become a low-level military bureaucrat. A gopher in a wrinkled green uniform. Diana knew of the rumors. She received the sporadic mandatory family notifications forwarded through the military personnel command. She never replied. When you spend your nights navigating a 100-ton stealth bomber through the black, freezing edge of the stratosphere, the social status of people who live on land begins to feel entirely inconsequential. They thought she was drowning in obscurity. In reality, she was learning how to command the sky. The Arctic Circle. Winter. 2024. The air inside the cockpit of the stealth bomber was thin and cold pressurized to maintain a delicate equilibrium against the hostile void outside. The stratospheric sky at 60,000 feet was a deep velvet indigo, almost black, fading into the curved blue horizon of the earth below. Diana sat in the pilot's seat, her hands wrapped firmly around the flight controls. Her face was obscured by a heavy tactical oxygen mask, her eyes reflecting the glowing green arrays of the primary multifunction displays. The tarnished silver wings of a pilot were pinned to her flight suit, stained by cockpit sweat and survival gear grease. They were deep within a denied sector of the Arctic Circle, operating under a total electronic blackout. Below them lay a vast frozen expanse of jagged ice sheets and sub-zero swamplands, a lawless territory where covert extraction operations were carried out in total secrecy. "Ma'am," whispered her co-pilot Lieutenant Miller through the internal intercom. "Primary telemetry is down. We just lost our connection to the satellite array. We're flying completely blind on inertial navigation. Keep her steady, Miller." Diana commanded, her voice calm and absolute through the comms loop. "We knew the interference would be heavy out here. Watch the temperature gauges on the leading edges." Their mission was a zero-fail black-budget extraction cover. A 4-man intelligence reconnaissance team was trapped on the frozen tundra below, pinned down by a hostile paramilitary force equipped with mobile anti-air missile launchers. The storm had grounded all conventional rescue helicopters. The only asset capable of reaching the area without triggering an international incident was Diana's stealth bomber, modified to deploy a high-speed, low-altitude cargo extraction rig. "Missile alert! Missile alert!" Miller suddenly shouted as the threat matrix console flashed to life in a violent, blinding amber. Surface-to-air radar tracking from bearing 020. They've painted our belly. 2 infrared homing missiles in the water. Sorry in the air. Time to intercept 45 seconds. Deploy the towed decoys, Diana ordered instantly, her voice dropping into that chillingly stable cadence that her crew relied on. Dump the thermal chaff. Miller, cut the engines to idle. We're going to drop like a stone. She pushed the control column violently forward. The massive stealth bomber pitched down into a terrifying near-vertical dive, screaming down toward the frozen Arctic marshlands at Mach 1.2. The structural frame of the aircraft groaned under the immense aerodynamic stress, the metal skins warping as they tore through the dense freezing air layers below. The tail assembly is taking too much force, Miller yelled, his body pinned against his harness by the negative G-forces. We're losing stability on the left elevator. A piece of structural plating just tore free. A violent explosion rocked the rear of the aircraft. One of the incoming missiles had detonated close to the tail wing, sending thousands of jagged titanium shrapnel pieces through the hydraulic lines. The left wing flared with a sudden bright burst of flame as the hydraulic fluid ignited in the airstream. The aircraft began to roll violently to the left, its nose spinning out of control toward the jagged ice sheets below. Alarms screamed in a chaotic chorus of red lights. Loss of primary flight controls. Miller panicked, his hands flying across the emergency systems. The hydraulic pressure is down to 0. We're going down. Diana, eject, eject. Negative. Diana said, her grip tightening on the mechanical backup system until her knuckles turned white through her gloves. Her heart rate monitor wired into the flight data recorder flickered on the screen. It read exactly 60 beats per minute. She engaged her tactical breathing, her mind isolating the variables with the cold efficiency of a computer core. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Lock for 4. The intelligence team is directly ahead of us, Miller, she said, her voice cutting through the alarms like a laser. If we eject this 100-ton aircraft crashes directly onto their coordinates, we are going to fly this plane down, we are going to extract that team, and we are going to take them home. Using asymmetric engine thrust, manually throttling the right engine up while cutting the left. She forced the asymmetric aerodynamic forces to counteract the broken tail assembly. The bomber's violent spin slowed the nose pulling out of the dive just 300 feet above the jagged snow-covered trees of the Arctic swamp. Rig the extraction line. Diana ordered, her muscles tearing as she held the giant aircraft stable by raw engine manipulation alone. Miller, drop the hook now. The stealth bomber roared over the extraction zone at 200 knots, its burning tail leaving a long streak of black smoke across the white sky. On the ground, the 4 intelligence scouts grabbed the high-speed extraction line as it swept across the snow, locking themselves into the harness, just as the aircraft surged upward back toward the clouds. "Scouts secure! They're in the lower bay!" Miller cheered, tears of adrenaline streaming down his face. "Get us out of here!" Diana said, her face covered in sweat, her uniform soaked through. She opened the throttles, forcing the crippled, burning aircraft back up into the freezing protective heights of the stratosphere, leaving the hostile missile teams far below in the freezing fog. The mission was a total legendary success. For saving the intelligence team under direct anti-aircraft fire with a crippled strategic bomber, Diana was secretly awarded the Air Force Cross, the second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism. But because the aircraft did not exist on any public register, the entire file was encrypted, sealed, and locked away behind a Level 10 national security firewall under the codename Black Budget. Back in New York, Eleanor Vance was sitting in an elite restaurant talking to a corporate partner. Yes, Diana is still doing minor administrative work for the military in Washington. Eleanor said with a patronizing sigh, cutting her steak. Counting spare parts, logging office supplies for a few $1,000s a year, she always lacked the drive for true corporate power. We expect Cassandra to take over the entire board by next winter. And 60,000 feet above the surface of the earth, the ghost pilot smiled into the velvet black sky. The rain over Manhattan did not fall. It slatted against the reinforced glass of the stratosphere vault like liquid shrapnel. 60 stories above the financial district, the VIP auditorium was a temple of architectural intimidation. Polished obsidian floors reflected the harsh white recessed lighting, and the walls were lined with soundproofed mahogany panels designed to ensure that the destruction of corporate adversaries remained strictly confidential. At the long, dark conference table sat the Vance family, positioned like high-seated judges at an imperial tribunal. Eleanor Vance looked immaculate. Her silver blonde hair coiffed into a tight crown-like structure, her fingers adorned with square-cut diamonds that caught the light with a clinical freezing glare. Next to her sat Arthur Vance, the patriarch, his face a soft, heavy mask of inherited privilege and administrative cruelty. Between them sat Cassandra, the golden child, 26 years old, wearing a custom-tailored white suit, her lips twisted into a small anticipatory smirk as she twirled a crystal glass of vintage champagne. At the head of their legal delegation stood Richard Lawson, the most feared corporate litigator on Wall Street, a man who had made a multi-million-dollar career out of breaking minority shareholders and erasing inconvenient lineages from family trusts. "She is 20 minutes late," Arthur Vance muttered, dabbing a silk handkerchief at his mouth. He dinned a heavy gold signet ring against the tabletop. "A complete lack of discipline. It proves exactly what we have always said. Give a girl a minor government stipend and a desk in a federal warehouse, and she loses all concept of real-world value." "Patience, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice a low, gravelly purr that had broken bank boards across the eastern seaboard. "The military teaches compliance through waiting. She is likely navigating the public transit system with her luggage. When she arrives, remember, she is not a daughter. She is an outstanding debt. We treat her as a non-performing asset to be liquidated." Cassandra laughed a sharp, airy sound. "I still cannot believe she refused to sign the preliminary transfer for the Newport Aerospace Research Complex. The nerve of a low-level clerk trying to hold on to a 9-figure research facility left to her by a senile grandfather. She probably thinks a research facility is just a big room where they store filing cabinets." The heavy double-reinforced security doors of the vault clicked open. Diana Vance stepped into the room. The transition was immediate, jarring, and absolute. She did not wear corporate silk or designer labels. She stood before them in the full dark midnight blue ceremonial dress uniform of a flag officer of the United States Air Force. The heavy gold braid on her sleeves, the thick star and double bars denoted the rank of Major General, though her family was too uneducated in military protocol to recognize the weight of the gold. Her chest was completely covered in multi-layered, highly restricted ribbon racks, including the silver-starred ribbon of the Air Force Cross, though the medals were small and unostentatious. She had not had time to change. Her flight from an urgent operational deployment had encountered a Category 4 storm. Her command transport had landed at Andrews Air Force Base less than 2 hours prior. Her heavy steel-toed flight boots were still rough and bared the dried white crust of runway salt and the distinct acrid smudge of JP-8 jet turbine fuel from the tarmac. Well, Richard Lawson chuckled, leaning back in his leather chair, a patronizing smirk playing across his thin lips. "Look what the wind blew in from the Pentagon supply closets. Diana, we were beginning to think you'd lost your way among the filing cabinets in Washington." Diana did not answer the insult. She walked toward the table with the slow, rhythmic stride of a commander stepping onto the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. Behind her walked Daniel, her husband, a quiet, broad-shouldered military medical officer in a simple service uniform carrying a slim black, military-issue encrypted digital briefcase. He did not speak. He simply stood 2 paces behind her, an immovable shadow of protection.
"Let's get right to the metrics, Diana,"
Richard Lawson said, slapping a thick white legal binder onto the center of the obsidian table. "We aren't here to waste time on family sentiment. Your sister Cassandra is currently finalizing a major federal defense supply contract for Vance Global Energy. Due to certain credit regularities regarding our manufacturing lines in Ohio, we require immediate collateral clearance, specifically the Newport Aerospace Research Complex." He slid a document across the polished stone toward her. It was a comprehensive deed of transfer stripping Diana of the research facility left to her by her late grandfather. "You are going to sign this complex over to Cassandra immediately," Lawson said, his tone shifting into the cold, demanding cadence of a federal prosecutor. "It's an act of basic restitution. For 15 years, this family financed your upbringing, your private elite tutors, your medical bills, and your lifestyle before you ran off to play soldier in the bureaucracy. You've been an absolute parasite on the family asset pool, hoarding a critical strategic resource, while Vance Global Energy, carrying the burden of a national enterprise, bears the burden of the national defense economy." Cassandra leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malicious intent. She took a slow sip of her champagne, then placed the glass down. With a deliberate mocking flick of her wrist, she tapped the long gray ash of her expensive cigarette directly onto Diana's copy of the legal documents right over the signature line. The gray flakes scattered across the pristine white paper, smudging the text with a dark, dirty stain. "Oops," Cassandra sneered, her voice full of cheap venom. "My hand slipped, sis. But then again, you're used to cleaning up ash and grease, aren't you? You're just a glorified inventory clerk, Diana. You sit at a metal desk and type manifests all day. The weight of this world, the true weight of this country, belongs to the people who operate 9-figure federal defense allocations, people like me. You sign that Newport complex over to me right now to pay for your 15 years of family charity, or we walk out of here and leave you with nothing." Eleanor Vance nodded, her diamonds flashing in the suite's recessed lighting. "You have always been profoundly selfish, Diana. You kept your little government salary, your high-security stipends in Washington, while your sister worked 20-hour days to maintain the family's position on Wall Street. You owe us this. Your father and I have decided that you have spent enough time living off the family's historical credits." Diana looked down at the cigarette ash scattering across the legal paper. She did not look angry. She did not look hurt. To a woman who had seen a 100-ton strategic bomber lose its tail assembly in the pitch-black silence of an Arctic missile storm, the petulance of a 26-year-old girl with a glass of wine was completely insignificant. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocatingly tight. Richard Lawson raised his voice, gesturing to the back of the auditorium, where several federal subcontractors and defense delegates were sitting as observers for the upcoming conference. "Let the record reflect the reality of the defendant's background," Lawson announced loudly, pulling a series of yellowed sheets from his binder. "We have compiled a comprehensive history of the costs incurred by the Vance family during Diana's development. Private schooling, $300,000. Specialized medical care, $80,000. General maintenance and elite deportment training, $500,000. All wasted on a child who turned her back on her lineage to shuffle papers for the state." He shook the forged invoices in the air, ensuring the observers could see them. "She stands here today in a pristine uniform, pretending to serve the nation, while she is nothing more than a financial debtor who refuses to pay her own mother for the bread she ate as a child." Arthur Vance slammed his crystal glass down onto the mahogany trim of the table, the sharp crack echoing through the high ceilings of the vault. "Don't give us your stubborn military silence, young lady. Arthur roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson.
We know exactly what you are. We have contacts in the Department of Defense. We know you're just a low-level procurement coordinator who checks serial numbers on aircraft parts. You are nothing. If you do not sign that document within the next 5 minutes, I will personally call the chief editor of our allied media networks. We will launch a comprehensive national press campaign detailing your severe mental instability, your erratic behavior as a child, and your history of psychological delusion. We will have you flagged under a mental health review before the weekend begins. You will be discharged as unfit for service.
Diana remained perfectly still. Her boots were planted firmly on the black floor. Through the smoke of Cassandra's cigarette and the roaring threats of her father, she did not flinch. Instead, she engaged her tactical respiration sequence, the 4-beat survival breathing she had mastered in the altitude chambers years ago. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Lock for 4 seconds. Behind her, the digital readout on Daniel's secure briefcase, which monitored her biometric feed via her tactical watch, showed her pulse locked flat, unyielding at exactly 60 beats per minute. Her nervous system didn't register their anger as a threat. She recognized it as the desperate, erratic flailing of an enemy that had already run out of ammunition. She looked at Eleanor, then at Arthur, and finally her eyes settled on Cassandra. They thought they were cornering a clerk. They had no idea they were locking themselves in a room with a major general who had already cleared her airspace for a terminal strike. "Daniel," Diana said softly, her voice cool and perfectly level. "Activate the network link."
Don't ignore me!
Arthur shouted, leaning across the table, his hand slamming onto the stained papers. "Sign the transfer now, or I swear to God, Diana, you'll be sleeping in a veteran's shelter by next month." "Be quiet, Arthur," Diana said. The tone was not loud, but it carried the absolute weight of a flag officer's supreme command, a voice that had commanded stealth bomber wings through international air defense networks. The sheer freezing authority in her voice caused Arthur's mouth to snap shut in involuntary shock. He sank back into his leather seat, his chest heaving, his corporate confidence suddenly shaken by a tone he had never heard from her before. Richard Lawson tried to step in, his smile turning tight.
"Legal authority in this jurisdiction rests on property rights general. Your uniform doesn't give you the right to occupy a 9-figure corporate asset left under a disputed will." "The asset is not disputed, Mr. Lawson," Diana said, her eyes locking onto his with the intensity of a fire control radar. "And my presence here today was never to negotiate with you."
Daniel stepped forward, placing his black digital briefcase on the table directly next to Cassandra's champagne glass. He pressed his thumb against the biometric sensor on the rim. With a soft electronic chime, the briefcase split open, revealing a high-level military satellite transceiver that immediately overrode the vault's internal wireless security blocks. The massive 80-inch presentation screen on the wall of the VIP room, which had been displaying the Vance Global Energy corporate logo, suddenly flickered, turned a deep slate gray, and then displayed a glowing red seal of the United States Department of Defense Joint Logistics Command. At the top of the screen, a file folder icon pulsed with a high-level digital asset tracking code marked 10DOCX. "What is the meaning of this?" Eleanor Vance asked, her voice cracking slightly as she stood up, her silk suit rustling in the sudden silence of the room.
"This is a private corporate arbitration."
"Who authorized that data link?"
"I did,"
Diana said, leaning slightly forward, her hands resting calmly on the edge of the obsidian table.
"You brought me here to present an invoice for my childhood mother. Now let's look at the actual forensic audit logs stored within the secure Federal Defense Network."
She tapped her finger on the transceiver console. The screen shifted, revealing an old federal document from the year 2021, a document stamped with the highest classification of the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice Security Division.
Let's talk about the year 2021.
Diana said, her voice dropping into a register that made Lawson's hands begin to tremble. The Vance family was facing a total asset forfeiture warrant for failing to disclose $12 million in offshore energy contracts. You were less than 48 hours away from a public federal indictment that would have destroyed your corporate credit lines permanently. She looked directly into Eleanor's pale eyes.
The $50,000 emergency tax penalty that stopped that indictment. It didn't come from your corporate banks. It was transferred from a restricted military hazardous duty compensation fund money I received while bleeding out from a shrapnel wound in the North China Sea. I paid your debt through a blind trust so that Cassandra could graduate from Wharton without the stain of a bankrupt family. You didn't lose this spire 4 years ago because the worthless overhead cost bought it back for you.
Cassandra's cigarette burned down to her fingers, but she didn't notice the heat. She stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open, as the real foundation of her family's wealth began to crack open before the eyes of the federal delegates sitting in the back of the room. The trap had been set. The network was live. And Diana Vance was just getting started. The ambient light in the stratosphere vault shifted violently from a warm corporate amber to the sterile cold blue of a federal tactical display. The massive screen behind Diana pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, casting long shadows across the polished obsidian table. Richard Lawson attempted to stand his polished corporate composure, fraying at the edges.
General Vance, or whatever it is you call yourself within the Supply Corps, this is highly irregular. Federal transceivers cannot be weaponized to hijack a private arbitration panel. I will have this entire proceeding thrown out by the state Supreme Court by noon tomorrow. Sit down, Mr. Lawson.
A voice boomed from the shadow of the doorway. The heavy oak doors clicked open a third time, but it was not another corporate suit who crossed the threshold. It was Federal Judge Harold Bennett, the senior magistrate for the Eastern District of New York and the chief oversight officer for the Department of Defense Strategic Procurement Council. He wore no judicial robes today. He wore a sharp, severe charcoal woolen coat that smelled of the winter air outside. Flanking him were 2 special agents from the Defense Contract Investigative Service, DCIS, their gold badges catching the blue glare of the presentation screen. Eleanor Vance's breath hitched in her throat. She recognized Bennett. He was the one federal judge whose signature could freeze global energy pipelines with a single executive order, a man entirely immune to the lobbyist capital of Wall Street. "Judge Bennett," Eleanor said, forcing her voice back into its practiced regal register. "We were told the Federal Procurement Oversight Committee wouldn't be reviewing our defense contract applications until the secondary hearing next month in Washington. The schedule has changed, Mrs. Vance." Judge Bennett said, his voice flat, devoid of the polite deference she was used to receiving from public officials. He walked directly to the center of the room, ignoring Lawson entirely, and stepped up to the secure terminal that Daniel had deployed. He pulled a physical titanium-cased cryptographic key from his pocket, inserting it into the digital interface. "I received an automated redline alert at my residence 45 minutes ago. A Level 10 national security asset file was unlocked in this grid. File marker Mark 10 DOCX. Cassandra laughed nervously, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Judge, there's been a massive misunderstanding. My sister Diana is a low-level inventory clerk for the Air Force Logistics Branch. She has somehow hacked into our corporate system to display falsified records about a minor family tax matter from years ago. She's trying to extort us to keep her inheritance." Judge Bennett did not answer her. He kept his eyes fixed on the display as the system processed his cryptographic key. The screen scrolled through millions of lines of encrypted military code, the security stencils turning from yellow to green, and then finally to a brilliant burning white. The indifference on the old judge's face evaporated. His eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He leaned forward, both hands slamming onto the edge of the console, his chest heaving as he read the system's cybersecurity stencils. The digital signature at the bottom of the operational deployment ledger was not a logistics officer's authorization stamp. It was a supreme electronic signature protected by a 5-layer biometric vault. The signature read, Major General Diana Vance, Commander of the Stratospheric Strategic Strike Element JSOC. The room grew so quiet that the rhythmic ticking of Arthur Vance's Patek Philippe watch sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Judge Bennett's hands began to shake. He skipped past the financial records, his fingers racing across the interface until he reached the operational combat logs dated December 14th, 2024. The location was listed as a black budget coordinate within the frozen tundra of the Arctic Circle, a mission that did not exist on any congressional record. He read the names of the isolated intelligence scouts who had been pinned down by hostile anti-aircraft missile fire. Team leader Captain Thomas Bennett, USMC, the judge's only son. The boy he had been told died in an unrecoverable aircraft training accident in Alaska, a lie manufactured by the Pentagon to protect the black budget secrecy of the operational theater. He read the technical flight log, how a single modified stealth bomber had deliberately entered a fatal Mach 1.2 dive through a missile storm, flying with a burning, shattered tail assembly to pull 4 men out of a frozen swamp before their lungs froze solid. The old man slowly stepped away from the console. His breath came in short, shuddering gasps. He turned around to face the table, his eyes wet with a sudden, overwhelming torrent of raw emotion. He looked at Diana. Really looked at her, seeing past the tarnished silver wings on her chest, seeing the soot-stained warrior who had pulled his son out of a burning fuselage while the world fell apart around them. To the absolute horror and paralysis of Eleanor, Arthur, and Cassandra, the senior federal judge of the Eastern District did not sit down at the bench. He stood perfectly straight, his spine snapping into a rigid, flawless military posture. He raised his right hand to his brow, executing the most formal, deeply respectful military command salute a civilian official could ever give to a supreme combatant.
General Vance,
Judge Bennett said, his voice cracking with an emotion that shattered the room's artificial corporate gravity.
For 18 months, I was told my boy's file was classified under an impenetrable black budget wall. I was told he was saved by a phantom pilot who didn't exist on paper. I have spent every night since then praying for the soul of the commander who brought my son back to me. The entire room froze into a block of solid ice.
The salute is acknowledged, Judge Bennett, Diana said, her voice remaining perfectly steady, a rock in the middle of a collapsing world.
At ease.
Cassandra's glass of champagne slipped from her fingers, hitting the polished obsidian table with a sharp, sickening crash. The pale gold liquid washed across the cigarette ash she had mocked Diana with, turning the white paper into a dirty, ruined smear. She didn't bother to clean it. Her face had turned the color of dry newsprint.
General!
Arthur Vance stammered, his hand flying to his chest, his signet ring clicking against his glass.
No, you have the wrong person, Judge. She's a clerk. She sits at a desk in Washington. She's an inventory gopher. Silence, you fool,
Judge Bennett roared, turning on Arthur with a savage, righteous fury that caused the old patriarch to flinch back into his leather chair.
The woman you have spent the last hour treating like an administrative parasite is the only reason your family name isn't currently listed on a federal treason indictment. She holds a higher operational security clearance than the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Diana looked at her military counsel, who stood at the side of the room. With a silent nod from her, the military lawyer activated the primary projection system, forcing the Mark 10 DOCX matrix to display its hidden forensic audit logs directly onto the screens. Let's review the actual financial ledger of the Vance family. Diana said, her voice dropping into that chillingly calm surgical tone she used when analyzing radar cross-sections. "The documents you brought here today to demand restitution for my childhood. Let's look at who was actually funding whom." The screen flashed, displaying an IRS federal lien order from the spring of 2021. "In 2021, Diana explained, her eyes fixing onto Eleanor Vance, Global Energy was under an unpublicized federal investigation for failing to disclose $12 million in foreign oil leases. The government was preparing to execute an immediate asset forfeiture warrant on this very tower and your estate in the Hamptons." A secondary financial transfer log illuminated the screen, a wire transfer originating from a restricted high-hazard military operational compensation vault. The $50,000 primary tax penalty that stopped that forfeiture, Diana said softly. "It didn't come from your corporate banks, Mother. It was transferred from my stratospheric field allowance money I earned while taking 5 Gs of force with a shrapnel wound in my side over the North China Sea. I paid your federal tax debt anonymously through a military blind trust so that Cassandra could graduate from Wharton without her classmates knowing her mother was a financial criminal. You didn't lose your home 4 years ago because the worthless overhead cost bought it back for you." Eleanor choked, her manicured hand clutching at her emerald necklace as the historical reality of her own survival was laid bare before the federal delegates sitting in the back of the room. "And then we have 2023. Diana continued, her fingers tapping the console as the screen shifted to a criminal trade fraud indictment from the state of Ohio. The screen showed Cassandra's name listed as the primary defendant in a corporate procurement scheme involving the illegal manipulation of aerospace logistics weights. "You were facing 3 to 5 years in a federal prison for corporate fraud, Cassandra," Diana said, looking at her sister with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Father tried to use his media contacts to bury it, but the state prosecutors wouldn't play along. The only reason that indictment was converted into a silent civil fine was because I signed a national security waiver transferring $45,000 from my military honor trust account to settle the state's trade deficit. I saved you from a cage, sister, and you just dropped your cigarette ash on my uniform." Cassandra sank back into her seat, her white suit suddenly looking like a shroud, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the entire foundation of her manufactured corporate brilliance disintegrated into nothingness. "Now, let's look at the document you brought for me to sign today," Diana said, her voice dropping into a register that was as cold and dark as the edge of the stratosphere. "The 9-figure federal procurement contract for the new hypersonic missile fleet that Vance Aviation Dynamics has been pursuing." The screen flashed one final time, turning a deep warning shade of crimson. A massive document popped up marked with the highest level of federal classification, Treason Prohibition Protocol. "Gah." "Cassandra," Diana said, "you thought you could maximize profit margins on the new missile defense contract by sourcing a cheap low-grade titanium composite through a shell company in Panama, then forging the quality assurance stencils to make it look like military-grade stratospheric alloy. You tried to use my grandfather's Newport Aerospace Research Complex as the primary collateral to back the bank loans for that manufacturing line." That's a lie!" Cassandra shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. "The alloy is certified. The papers are right here in my briefcase." "The papers in your briefcase are a federal forgery, Miss Vance," Judge Bennett said, his voice striking the room like a gavel. "The Defense Contract Investigation Service, DCIS, has been monitoring your supply lines for 6 months. Every single pound of titanium you shipped to the Newport yards was flagged as a deliberate act of industrial sabotage against the structural integrity of the United States Air Defense Network. And who do you think holds the supreme encryption key to authorize a total network freeze on defense corporate assets?" Diana asked. She reached down, took a sleek encrypted military-issue digital token from her uniform pocket, and pressed her thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen flashed with absolute finality. System alert. Vance Aviation Dynamics. All digital assets frozen. Federal contract procurement rights revoked permanently. National Security Protocol Level 10 lockdown activated. The person who directly signed the command to seal your network strip, your corporate charter, and terminate your family's legacy is sitting right across from you, Diana said, her eyes reflecting the crimson alert on the wall. Through the authorization code within the Mark 10 DOCX asset file, I have officially declared Vance Aviation Dynamics an active threat to national security. Your company is dead. Your capital is gone. Your name is erased. She stood up, her flight boots planted firmly on the obsidian floor, looking down at the vipers who had tried to consume her. The flight line is clear, Mr. Lawson, Diana said softly. And your targets are locked. The red light pulsing from the terminal screen cast an ominous blood-like wash over Richard Lawson's tailored Tom Ford suit. The legendary Wall Street litigator who had built a career on arrogance and stripping the assets of vulnerable adversaries felt the cold air of a federal penitentiary closing around his neck. He looked at the two armed DCIS agents blocking the exits. He looked at Judge Bennett, whose eyes were fixed on him with frozen disgust. Finally, he looked across the obsidian table at Diana Vance. The gold stars on her shoulders didn't just represent rank, they represented the absolute sovereign power of a nation she had bled to protect. General Vance! Lawson stammered, his hands shaking violently as he frantically shoved his legal pads and gold fountain pens back into his leather briefcase. I must state for the record that I was completely insulated from the technical logistics of this contract. I was merely retained to handle the civil transfer of the Newport Aerospace property. I had absolutely zero knowledge of the falsified stencils, the Panamanian shell companies, or the counterfeit titanium alloys. You logged 3 separate strategy meetings with Cassandra Vance regarding the supply line metrics, Mr. Lawson. Daniel said, his voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. He didn't look up from his encrypted screen. The metadata logs in the Mark 10 DOCX file show your private digital signature on the secondary liability waivers. You knew exactly what she was shipping to the Newport yards. Lawson's face turned an unearthly shade of gray. Sweat broke out along his receding hairline, staining his silk collar. He did not say another word. He slammed his briefcase shut, turned away from the family that had paid his multi-million-dollar retainers for over a decade, and practically threw his weight against the heavy double doors of the vault. The federal marshals stepped aside, allowing the coward to flee into the blinding Manhattan rain, leaving the Vance family entirely defenseless. Arthur Vance watched his prized attorney abandon them, his jaw hanging open in sheer disbelief. Richard, get back here. You can't leave us stranded. We have a board meeting at 5. But there was no answer. The doors clicked shut with a hollow final thud. Eleanor Vance sat frozen, her posture finally breaking. The architectural marvel of her high society breeding crumbled, her shoulders slumping as she stared at the glowing red text on the wall. The empire she had spent her life constructing on the backs of others had just been declared an active threat to national security. Diana. Eleanor whispered, her voice no longer a commanding purr, but a thin, ragged scrape. You cannot do this. We are your family. We gave you your name. If Vance Aviation Dynamics falls, the social standing of this house is ruined. Think of the press. Think of what our peers on Wall Street will say. Diana looked at her mother through the sterile blue light of the vault. Her expression was completely blank. You told me 10 years ago that the Vance name exists to command capital, Mother. Well, the capital has been decommissioned. Your name belongs to the federal courts now. Before Arthur could mount another verbal defense, The reinforced security doors of the Stratosphere Vault were slammed open with a violent metallic bang. 4 heavily armored tactical agents from the Defense Contract Investigative Service, DCIS, strode into the room, their black ballistic vests emblazoned with gold federal lettering. Behind them stood 3 Air Force Security Forces airmen in full combat gear, their presence emphasizing that this was no longer a civil arbitration. It was a high-level military apprehension.
Cassandra Vance,
the lead DCIS agent announced, pulling a red-stamped federal arrest warrant from his tactical folder.
You are under arrest for federal procurement fraud in the first-degree deliberate sabotage of military equipment under the National Security Act and treasonous misrepresentation of defense materials.
Cassandra's mind shattered. The golden child who had spent her life sipping vintage champagne and looking down on her sister from the heights of Wharton completely broke. She let out a sharp, hysterical shriek as she tried to scramble away from the table, her expensive white suit twisting as she tripped over her own designer heels. She collapsed violently onto the polished obsidian floor, her glass shattering against the stone, splashing pale gold liquid across her face.
Mother, Father, do something,
Cassandra screamed, her voice cracking into a ragged sob as she crawled backward like a trapped animal.
They can't touch me. I'm the CEO. I run the defense allocations, Diana. You bitch tell them to stop.
An armored agent stepped forward, completely unbothered by her screaming. He hauled Cassandra up by her arms and pushed her against the witness buck. With a sharp, freezing clink, the heavy steel handcuffs locked around her wrists. She hung there, her styled hair ruined, weeping hysterically onto the stained legal documents she had mocked just minutes before.
Get your hands off my daughter,
Arthur Vance roared, his face turning a dangerous, hypertensive purple as he tried to lunge across the table to protect his favorite child. He didn't even make it halfway. 2 DCIS agents intercepted him, instantly grabbing his wrists and forcing him down onto the obsidian tabletop with a crushing clinical efficiency. A heavy plastic zip tie snapped into place around his thumbs. Arthur gasped for air, his face pressed flat against the stone directly into the puddle of champagne and cigarette ash Cassandra had left behind. Eleanor Vance stayed in her chair, entirely paralyzed. Her eyes were wide, staring at her husband and daughter being handled like common street criminals. She looked at Diana, who stood at the head of the table, untouched by the chaos, watching the execution of the warrants, with the detached calmness of a pilot watching a target clear from 60,000 feet. The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow to the chest. The daughter she had discarded as a worthless overhead cost, the girl she believed was counting screws in a dark warehouse, was the absolute sovereign holding the power of life and death over their entire existence. Eleanor fell from her leather chair, her knees hitting the hard stone floor with a dull, pathetic thud. She crawled forward through the shattered crystal and spilled champagne, her manicured hands once painted the color of dried blood reaching out to clutch desperately at the mud-stained leather of Diana's flight boots. "Diana, please," Eleanor wept, the tears ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks across her face. "I am your mother. I brought you into this world. I was wrong about the academy. I was wrong about everything. You are the true strength of the Vance bloodline. Please, use your intelligence clearance. Make one phone call to the Pentagon. Clear Cassandra's name. She won't survive a federal prison, Diana. It will kill her." Diana looked down at the broken woman groveling at her feet. She felt no rush of adrenaline. She felt no petty joy. She only felt the profound, freezing emptiness of an operation that had reached its inevitable conclusion. The woman who had thrown her Air Force appointment into the fireplace 10 years ago was now begging for mercy from the very uniform she had tried to incinerate. Diana reached up slowly, adjusting the stiff gold-braided visor of her Major General's service cover. The emblem of the gold American eagle gleamed under the vault's lights. She looked into Eleanor's frantic, weeping eyes, her own pale gaze as cold and unyielding as the ice sheets of the Arctic Circle. "I do not negotiate with parasites in expensive suits, Mother," Diana said, her voice dropping into a register that was absolute, final, and permanent. "And I certainly do not trade the safety of my pilots for the survival of traitors. 10 years ago, you told me my only utility to this family was to balance your corporate ledger. Consider this the final audit. The invoice for your arrogance has come due. Now you have to live with it." She stepped back, pulling her boot smoothly from Eleanor's trembling grasp. "Daniel," Diana said quietly, turning to her husband. "Let's go. Our airspace is clear." Daniel nodded, took her hand, and together they walked out of the stratosphere vault. Behind them, the pathetic weeping of Eleanor and the frantic screaming of Cassandra were cut off instantly as the heavy soundproof doors sealed shut for eternity. They stepped into the private elevator, the digital screen tracking their rapid descent to the street level. As the elevator glided silently through the core of the skyscraper, Diana leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, closing her eyes as she let out a long, slow breath she felt she had been holding since she was 18 years old. The weight of the ancestral trauma had been lifted. The golden cage had been turned to ash. She had walked into that room as an unrecoverable liability. She walked out of it as the complete master of her own sky. 3 years later, the morning sun over Washington, D.C. was brilliant and crisp, casting long golden light across the white marble structures of the National Air and Space Museum. A gentle wind swept off the Potomac River, carrying the clean, sharp scent of open air and autumn leaves. Diana walked slowly down the long gallery of the museum's primary aviation pavilion. She was 31 now, her flag officer's uniform resting in her closet at the base. Today she wore a simple, elegant cream-colored trench coat, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders, her face bright and filled with a peace she had never known during her years on the flight line. Clutched tightly in her right hand was the small, warm palm of a 3-year-old girl named Lily. Lily had bright, curious blue eyes and hair that curled into soft rings around her ears. She was Cassandra's daughter, the child who had been completely abandoned by her high society father when the Vance empire collapsed into total bankruptcy, and Cassandra began her 12-year sentence at the Federal Correctional Facility in West Virginia. The rest of the family had scattered into the winds of obscurity. Their properties seized their credit lines, canceled their names, erased from the social registers of New York. When the Military Family Support Network had notified Diana of an abandoned child with the Vance surname, she had not hesitated. She had signed the adoption papers within 48 hours, bringing the innocent little girl into her own home, breaking the generational chain of cruelty with a single unconditional act of love. "Look, Mommy, look!" Lily chirped, pointing her small finger upward toward the massive, towering structure that loomed over the center of the pavilion. It was the preserved, decommissioned stealth bomber that had saved the intelligent scouts under the Arctic Circle years ago. The matte black skin had been polished to a brilliant dark shine, its long sweeping wings casting a massive protective shadow over the green lawns of the museum. Next to them stood Daniel, his arm sliding gently around Diana's waist, his warmth grounding her as they looked up at the great iron ghost of her past. "She looks like she's ready to fly right off the roof, doesn't she, Lily?" Daniel smiled, looking down at the little girl. "It's a big bird." Lily laughed, skipping forward a few steps, her small shoes clicking merrily on the white stone tiles. Diana watched her daughter run under the shadow of the stealth bomber's massive nose cone, the same frame she had held stable by raw engine thrust alone through a missile storm. She looked at the little girl's bright, unburdened smile and realized that the war was finally over. She had survived the freezing exile of her youth. She had mastered the lethal, suffocating pressure of the stratosphere. She had shattered the corrupt monarchy of her ancestors, not with hatred, but with the unyielding iron truth of her own worth. And here, beneath the shadow of the silent beast that had defined her crucible, she had built something her mother could never understand, a family founded on honor, a legacy defined by courage, and a life that was completely, beautifully, and sovereignly free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.